Communications provider KT has begun a major voluntary retirement campaign. The company will be accepting early retirement applications from employees that have worked 15 years or longer for that company. And KT is definitely not alone in this downsizing efforts. For an in-depth discussion into this issue, we have Dr. Byoung-joo, the head of KL&P Consulting, live in the studio. Good afternoon to you, Dr. Kim.
Good afternoon.
Now, we see almost all of Korea's leading companies now undertaking major restructuring drives. Now, what is the scale? I mean, how serious is the commitment?
Looks like it's pretty much economy-wide, perhaps the entire business community we are talking about here. As you mentioned, KT was the first runner in a way, introducing this kind of changes and innovation or restructuring of their business, but quickly followed by POSCO's case with the new head of Kwon Ho-gyun, for instance, and of course KT Hwang Chang-gyun was famous for introducing his ambitious plan for cutting down the workforce as a whole. But it's not only that, but also overall just finding new directions seems to be the overall change that we are seeing here. They're talking about 4 R's indeed: reshaping, remodeling, rebuilding, and restructuring. Reshaping is like in Samsung's case, for instance, sort of like changing the overall structure of the group focus of their group businesses, shedding off unnecessary ones in a way, consolidating big time. And the remodeling, in the case of Hyundai, for instance, just totally trying to introduce a totally new design of new designed models for their main product. And also rebuilding, SK's case, kind of like trying to rebuild their main line of business with new, different kind of things. And of course, last R, fourth R, restructuring, just like KT's case, kind of like a good old ways of solidifying the business and shedding off the workforce and consolidating and all that. So this is indeed, as you mentioned, as you asked the question, and my answer would be the entire business community-wide, and the commitment seems to be very serious. Indeed, one of the most serious level of restructuring and reshaping of their businesses by Korean leaders of Korean businesses for the first time in about 2 decades.
Right, 2 decades. So, you know, the 4R you mentioned, it seems like they are going to go ahead with an overhauling the companies. Now, top leaders such as Samsung and Hyundai Motor Groups are leading this drive, right?
Right, indeed, right. And we mentioned first time in 2 decades, and for sure in Samsung's case, it is indeed, a lot of people are saying, the biggest, most ambitious drive to restructure their business model first time in 2 decades. 2 decades ago, at the end of 1997, about 2 decades ago, Samsung was trying to introduce like a totally different design of their businesses in order to survive. This time, they're saying on the peak of their business performance, they're trying to find new ways to lead next leap forward, indeed, and that's what they're trying to do. Recently, we covered in this segment about their consolidation of their traditional business of textile and fashion business, and then how the new line of businesses of batteries go into different units of companies and so on. And also in the chemical area in Samsung, chemical and petrochemicals, they're being solidified, and there are different areas that are being further downsized, such as financial areas, finance areas, Samsung life insurance, for instance, and Samsung Securities, they're facing big time downsizing here in terms of workforce. And Hyundai, same story goes. As one of the leaders of Korean business, they're also trying to kind of like focus on what they're strong at, meaning the more of the solidifying and finding new business for the auto side, and then shedding off all the extra ones on the non-auto side. So Hyundai, Samsung, they're both really leading this kind of change, this round of changes for Korea's business community big time.
Now, I suppose that for survival purposes, the next tier business groups are also more desperate about this restructuring or downsizing efforts.
I think you're right about that, indeed. While Samsung and Hyundai are actually trying to introduce this kind of changes at the peak of their performance, the second tier group, such as Hanwha, they're trying to really find new ways for survival. For instance, Hanwha Chemical is pushing big time forward into their battery business, for instance, not battery, but the solar power business, indeed. And the SK's group, as I mentioned briefly before, they're trying to get rid of some of the businesses that they're not very hot about, and then trying to build the new ones through the by creating different kinds of communication services here. And POSCO, looks like interesting thing is they seem to be, for now at least, turning back to the good old basics, which is steel making. The previous chairman had tried many different things. Now, new chairman is kind of like bringing the focus back to their good old business of steelmaking. But at the same time, he will have to find new business to take the corporation forward for the next several decades. And KT side, for now, downsizing is a big word here because they're reducing 20%, 1 out of 5 people there in terms of workforce to cut the cost here. And then Lotte is going into the food business big time by solidifying several of their companies into one called the Lotte Food. And so a lot of eyes are closely watching how these second-tier businesses are trying to transform their businesses themselves.
You mentioned the timing of the downsizing by Samsung and Hyundai at the peak of their performances, I suppose. And of course, last week we were hearing that the government and the central bank saying that the economy is in a continuous upswing. Why all this restructuring now? I mean, how do you explain the timing?
Actually, a lot of people are asking that question. Looks like economy is going pretty well, at least according to the government authorities and the central bank here. But the thing is, while the overall economy seems to be improving, the thing is, by sector, if we go into breakdown of these kind of performances, actually it's automobile and semiconductors that are doing, but in other areas, Korean businesses are not doing that well at this point. So what's happening is, as I mentioned, in automobile and semiconductors, at the peak of their performance, they're trying to find new path forward, while other industries such as chemicals, steel making, ship making, these kind of businesses are really facing this extended difficulty and challenge. So they have no other choice rather than finding ways to slim down themselves. And also we have two forces going on, like trying to find new path at the peak of their performance, and then the other one just out of desperation trying to find new ways out of the overall difficulties that has been extending. A lot of people are saying since 2008, Korean corporations could not find a chance to introduce these kind of changes in order to just survive for the last several years, but now they're finding timing to introduce this kind of new changes. That's what's happening as a whole. And one last thing is from the external side, government, as you mentioned, while they're emphasizing the overall upturn of the business cycle, they're all at the same time asking for restructuring and remodeling of these businesses for the sake of the health of the financial sector here. So together with the internal logic for change, one, and then external pressure from the government and the financial sectors, all these businesses are trying to find new ways out. And as I mentioned before, other than the automobiles and semiconductors, this traditional business where Korea has betted a lot on its survival and prosperity for the past several decades, such as steelmaking and shipbuilding and all that, Korean business community really faces a desperate need to find new path for their growth, meaning new businesses. So that's why we are seeing all these changes coming all together at this particular timing.
Right, a new catalyst that will push them forward for another round of business excelling performance, I suppose.
Absolutely.
All right, Dr. Kim Byoung-joo, thank you so much for today, and we will speak to you tomorrow again.
Okay.